Good morning. I'm Kent McGuire, damp, because I don't live in the Hilton. And I've moved to California where it does not rain quite like this. Glad to have you all here. If any of you want to move up a little bit, that's just fine. I've been advised by Carolyn Harrington to be exceedingly brief. And I don't know why she thinks I wouldn't be. Thank you very, very, very much. Last year in San Antonio, I had the great honor and privilege of presenting the Distinguished Public Service Award to Michael Kirst. Only he wasn't there. And so we thought it made a lot of sense to do it again and to, in this instance, give him an opportunity to reflect in person on what I think is an extraordinary career. Not often that we see academics make such a big mark, not only in the academy, but also in the public policy arena. And this might be a special instance of that. And having moved out to California myself, where he's had a special presence, his impact is not limited to California, to be sure. I am personally really very interested to hear what he has to say. So if you'll just join me in welcoming Mike Kirst to the stand.
Well, thank you for coming on such a rainy day, and appreciate all of you showing up. And this is, in some ways a personal award, and so it'll be a personal statement. I'm going to, in this case, talk about the use of educational research in my own career. Basically, not too many people in education policy have 20 years of service in public policy as a public policy maker. I began in Washington in 1964 in the Johnson administration in the Office of Management and Budget, and began there in K-12 education, and ended up preparing memos to the president on Title I and how much it should cost and all that sort of thing. I was 25 years old, and so I made this grand tour through Washington. I worked for the U.S. Department of Education. I was Associate Director of the White House Fellows, and then I went to the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Manpower, Employment, and Poverty. And my boss, Senator Clark of Pennsylvania, was defeated, and Humphrey lost, and so I had to leave town and move. I had hoped temporarily to California, to Stanford University. Never thought of being a professor, farthest thing from my life, but thought, well, I'll wait it out in D.C. Until D.C. changes. So I've been at Stanford since 1969, and I met through a mutual friend, Jerry Brown, in 1974. And he was concerned about the Serrano decision, so I became his education advisor for his campaign, and I've advised him ever since, including to our meeting last Thursday, all these years, including when he was mayor of Oakland and he tried to take over the schools, and that didn't work. Served as president in his first two terms, 75 through 82, and then started back with him in 2010. And we both, our term I'm in now, the first and fourth terms of my presidency and his governorship are separated by 40 years. So I don't think that can possibly happen again. But through all of this, the best years of my career have been ages 71 through 79 years old. So I'm here today to talk to you about those best years, what I've tried to do and the state of California has tried to do and has done in many ways. And of course, I have been at Stanford University as a professor since 1969, so had lots of chance to work with other colleagues there and many, many students who are really useful to helping me. So I'm not going to prepare a meta-analysis or synthesis of research impact. I'm going to start off with a research impact and then move to and demonstrate it by moving to our policies in California and ending with some rather encouraging results that we're getting from our policies. Nothing conclusive, but suggestive. So I'm going to really look at what I've learned in research and how we'd applied it to California policy, making it specific about what it really means, and in that regard, the understanding of policy. Research does matter, and I think I'm going to demonstrate that because as a policymaker, I just have used a whole bunch of them. So I think research matters, at least in my experience, of course, under particular conditions and leaders. It matters without those two conditions, but it matters, I think, particularly with those conditions. And so, nobody, I think, would deny that the 1964-1967 era of Lyndon Johnson was an explosion of education policy. And also then when Jerry Brown came back in 2011 after winning in 2010, we had what John Kingdon, an eminent professor, calls the policy window opening in California in 2011. We had a rising tide. There's three vector forces of the policy window concept. Rising tide of revenue. Our revenue really took off at 2012 with an marginal income tax rate on income of 13%. You collect a lot of revenue in a rising tide, and it's continued to rise. So part of the story is that condition is really there. Second of all, we had a united political coalition for all of those years of the education groups, the business groups, even the Republican Party, and the extent that it has much influence there, and have really been able to sustain this winning coalition over a period of time. And so that's very important in that regard, and I'll talk later about our big trade with the teachers' organizations. To oversimplify it, we traded them. We won't do teacher evaluation while we phase in Common Core if you support us on everything else. And so we've had the United Education Coalition, and it's been needed to do it. And finally, the third vector force, as I said, of big ideas that are out there to be worked on. So let's go back to the beginning on some of the research policy. I remember being in the U.S. Office of Education with Frank Keppel when the Title IV of that era passed, the Education Research Act, which set up the federal research policies. And I think, the initial conversations was, well, we can make this like agriculture. We'll copy that model, and it'll be straight line from research to the farmer. And so somehow the vision was, well, we're going to be able to influence classrooms directly with research through some intermediate people who would be like the agricultural extension agents. So that moved the idea to, well, the country's big, so we should set up these regional labs everywhere. Most of them still exist today. Some of them focus on policy, and most of them have a federal comprehensive center. And so the labs was a legacy. And we have a lab out where we are called WestEd. And WestEd is in some ways an adjunct of my office as state board president. We just use them they have a federal comprehensive center of $6 million, which we use for federal and state policy. I use them to run administrative processes around new regulations. So the regional lab that was set up then exists today, and I met with Glenn Harvey and said, I need you really strong to implement Common Core, and they have produced. So, you know, there's an example of an institution which has been really invaluable from that point. There was a shift, the early literature on research use and policy, not, you know, necessarily on teaching, but on policy, was was pessimistic. David Cohen and Lindblom wrote a book called the Use of Educational Research. They thought it was very poor and not very promising in 1979. But the person that has most influenced my thinking about research use is the late Carol Weiss. And she looked at this with a very different lens. And she said, in particularly looking at research and policy, that research is what she sees it as a process of not the direct line thing of the agricultural extension agent saying, here's a new corn seed, plant it, that it's a more indirect process. She called it knowledge creep, that research filters over a long period of time into public policy making, and you don't see it very quickly, and it isn't exactly very direct. But it creeps through the system. She used the idea of it percolation, of the research percolating through the system. And so she traced how this happened with a decade of research, which I think is really on the money, because these ideas, they lie fallow for a while, and then you get the policy window opening, for example, and all of a sudden you can use all this stuff. And that's what I'll talk about later in that regard. Carol also talked about the use of research for enlightenment, that it wasn't just this specific policy or how to teach math, but it enlightened the policymakers about how they should think about a problem, and that it really enabled a change assumptions of how you approach policy. And if you think about that over time, for example, Head Start, the research there has been, you know, we need to get more somewhat formal instruction in Head Start, and that has also changed the assumption about the program. Another area that I think is worthwhile looking at in research use before I get to the policy is that, is the stages of the policymaking process. This is Aaron Wildofsky's idea that different research applies to different stages of policymaking. And so Aaron was in the view that the first stage of policy is you know you have a problem. So often we don't know that, and various problems are elucidated by that. Right now I'm doing some work on upgrading and skilling adult workers who are going to be and already have been displaced by technology and AI. And so that area is, I think, an important area of, you know, you have a problem here, we're not prepared to do this. Second area then is your policy gets on the agenda. Research plays a crucial role in prioritizing the agenda. Third stage is policy comes up with alternatives to solve the problem. Much research done there. Hank Levin spoke yesterday about the uses of cost effectiveness for this. And then the fourth stage is the actual making of the policy. That's often the sausage making in the legislature. And then you have its implementation. I'll talk about that, a lot of implementation research. And then finally you have the evaluation process of whether it worked or not. So there's research in all those phases. And it's been useful for in all of those phases and useful for me. So a lot of my early influence after I completed my first 2 terms on the State Board of Education, Jim Guthrie and I created a state policy center called PACE, Policy Analysis for California Education. It's still going strong. And we, in addition to producing research, we brokered a lot of research. That research impacts policy, but it often takes some brokers to connect it, to reduce its technical component, tailor it to the context, and feed it into the issue networks that will carry forth advocacy for it. So Kent worked for the Education Commission of the States. That was a classic policy broker in my view. And he also reduced the content of it and so it pasted both original research and the other. We focused on communication components. Nothing is more effective in the policy process than oral. The policymakers don't read a lot, and therefore the more you can sit down, talk with them, and reduce it, the better. So one of the earliest uses, of course, of school finance, of research by me, was the school finance equity research. Overview of that in Ladin Hansen, and much more since then. And there, of course, there were all the concepts from what was equity in school finance, how you arrange school finance formulas to be more equitable, does money matter, where does it matter, and so all of that has been, I think, quite effective in it. And it has worked through the entire policy making process. Particular of use in California, and I'll get into California straight away, has been various. We could make policy. We had 2/3 Democrats almost in the legislature. We had a governor with a very strong education policy focus and a lot of knowledge about it after he was the mayor of Oakland. And therefore we used concepts, and LeMahieu and Bright have a short book which summarizes all these different ones. Implementation science, which of course looks at variations in outcomes based on variations in implementation, has a key role for the teacher, looks at the structure of implementation. Various phases of this have been perfected. Network improvement communities, I'm sure most of you have heard of those. We're using those in California. They're particularly good for taking problems like improving graduation rates or taking the right courses for college, and you look at that point of data, try things, continue, see whether they're working, continue to improve them, form the people that are working on it into collaborative networks who talk and get synergy with each other. Positive deviance, we have these outstanding school districts that have done a really good job. Long Beach, Sanger in the Central Valley, Garden Grove, which is in suburban Orange County, all low income. Really nice book by Jane David and Joan Talbert on Sanger in the Central Valley. And you look at these districts that are very ordinary, like Garden Grove, and understanding that they can do it and have improved achievement has been really useful for us. And finally, evaluation research. One of the key areas of California change was we tried to somewhat change the local budget process through requiring local districts, as they received much more money, to do a local control accountability plan on how they're going to use the money. And that, a 3-year plan, we've given them a template and a structure for that. The evaluation research began, pasted some of this. And early on we really had too much compliance in it, and we have been moving it, as you'll see, into much more of a decision-making document. Okay, finally, these are the sort of themes that I have learned in state policy over these years. Patience. It takes a really long time. I spend a lot of time verbally saying to legislators and the public, this is a 10-year process to even get to somewhere that we're beginning to show that we need it. You need to have patience. And I think all of our policymakers have bought into that and stayed with it. Persistence. You need to just stay with your lines of policy. You can't zigzag all over the place. And you need to persist in making it holistic, integrated, and aligned. I'll demonstrate that. Humility. You can't do that much from the center. It's too complex. It's too large. You can't be too prescriptive. And in many ways, you do things you don't know where. With this local control accountability plan, we didn't know how it would work or whether it would work. So you proceed with humility. And that's been a watchword of the old. When Jerry Brown first came into office, I was 35. He was 35. Gray Davis, who was Jerry Brown's executive assistant, he was 35. And Bill Honig was on the state board at 35. And our view was, we get these old guys out of here in Sacramento, we'll solve these problems. We're the smart guys. And then we all come back, and we're a humble bunch of people proceeding with great humility and plunges into the unknown. So, as I've said, the policy window opened in 2012. And we've spent quite a bit of money, $60 billion, on school finance reform and funding our programs, which I will talk about straight away. First, the context. Talk about humility. I wish I'd been born in Delaware or Rhode Island or something. Instead, I drew this hand. 6.3 million students in California. It's just gigantic. 53% Hispanic, 25% white. 53% Hispanic, 25% white, 16% Asian, and 6% African American. So no state has a handle like this, and all those trends continue to be slightly intensified. And we have 1.4 million of those students who are classified as English learners. This is just so much bigger than any other state. Indeed, our enrollment, if you added it up, would be larger than the 22 smallest states' total enrollment. Our education budget at the state level is larger than the total state budget of 25 states. And we have 11,130 schools. So it's, quite big, and we go from Maine to South Carolina, if you put us on the map in terms of the U.S. One day, last summer, it was 56 degrees in Eureka and 123 in Death Valley. So no other state has that kind of condition either with its change. We've been below national average in spending. We've been making up some ground and in national assessment. And we're above the national average in child poverty. California is increasingly a barbell of pretty rich people and poor people. And then we have the lowest percent in the United States of English spoken at home. Often people don't look underneath, they just look at poverty or something like that. So it's quite a challenging setup to do and quite difficult to figure out how to make policy. So as I indicated, our top priorities, money is a means to an end, and so our priorities are at the center of what we do, and you'll see that in a minute, are the Common Core standards. We never backed off on Common Core. We never had any organized opposition of any significant type on Common Core. The next generation science standards, we're trying out a three-dimensional assessment on science, piloting it as we speak across California. That's a piece of work in assessment history, I think, and then history, and I should have added civics there, which we have overhauled. So people say, what's the biggest thing you've done? And I say, as you'll see, the core is, what are you trying to do? A lot of this is how, but what in that regard? Then we repealed, we created the local control funding formula. The state had 41 categorical programs. The last one added was Governor Schwarzenegger had dinner with Alice Waters at the her famous restaurant, and he walked out of there and wanted a school garden program. So we got a categorical earmark, number 41, for school gardens. So when we came into office, a lot of schools had beautiful gardens in the back, but the bathrooms couldn't be cleaned. So, you know, we had them so tied up in knots and an education code around it. So we repealed vast amounts of programs, virtually all the categoricals except special ed, and then really repealed vast amounts of regulation and essentially sent the money down with much more flexibility. A 3-year plan on the local control accountability plan. Each district does that. The budget process at the local level is largely incremental, not policy-oriented. You know, they look whether it balances. It's not something where you try and use the budget locally to really change things or turn around policy. So the LCAP, Local Control Accountability Plan, has been important. Moldable measures accountability, our dashboard, I'll talk about that. And of course, your chief goal is improving classroom instruction. One thing I learned, particularly from the Consortium from Policy Research and Education work I did with, you know, Susan Furman and Dick Allmore and David Cohen and so on, was I had started mostly in finance and governance, and my academic reputation is around school politics and who controls the schools and the textbook political dynamics of American education. So, you know, there was decades of my life where I was operating too far above the scene of the classroom and the school. And it wasn't until later in my career that I really got that package together in terms of being able to do that in my arsenal. That's why these years have been, I think, more productive for me. So first of all, we had to get over the problem of DC. In that time, we did not get race to the top. We were one of 8 states that did not get a waiver, and I tell you all this as a badge of honor. We very early on saw that the Obama administration was going to be very prescriptive on what they wanted. I was a race to top evaluator, and you know, each little itty bitty area got 5 points, and some got 7, and I added all a score up, and frankly, it didn't fit my sense of these states. I've been around, you know, and they had these grant writers write them up, and you know, and to me, they were going to have huge amount of state control in a local control setting in the Midwest, which didn't seem to me likely. But there was a lot of details, and Mr. Duncan told me that we had to have a teacher evaluation program state defined in 11,130 schools in the year 2015. And I said, Jesus, I think that's just crazy. We're implementing the Common Core. We're going, during that period, that's the crucial period of our implementation. And we're going to evaluate them on that before we've had the capacity building. And it is the beginning year of our Smarter Balanced Assessment, which is a huge jump shift from our old closed-end test. And so we passed on those, and in that regard, we're in the doghouse in Washington. Duncan came into the state and criticized Governor Brown for lack of teacher evaluation. Governor Brown wrote Duncan a letter, and it said, you need, quote, you need to proceed with more humility, close quote. And that we don't have the answers, and we don't think you do either. But the main reason we passed is the old policy concept I learned, of policy overload. You can overload the schools with too much policy. And our reckoning was we would have a really hard time making our reforms go. And if we tried to do his on top of that, they didn't fit very well in many ways. We would be incoherent and overloading. So we did, and then we also negotiated with the unions for support on that era. So we phased accountability in as we phased in our support system for teachers, and we're really, I'll talk about that in a minute. So here is my grand system. This is right out of the playbook of the Consortium for Policy Research and Education. which we worked out in many, many papers, and I used to go around to states. At the center are your standards, and that's really what you're trying to implement. And then I have this policy wheel, and that was always in my mind, that you need to align and have deep policies in all these areas to make it work. So alignment, coherence, so you look, and I'll mention what we've done in each of these areas. You look for the policy gaps, the policy conflicts, make sure that you're addressing everything. All the pieces of the pie must be addressed. Look for conflicting things where, make sure that you're not running an English learner program that is not in line with your Common Core program. And particularly make these policies be implemented in depth. And that particularly there would be, of course, preparing the teachers to do that, to teach to this Common Core area. So we, of course, overhauled the curriculum with Common Core. We did a framework for California, which defines Common Core standards more specifically. It gives advice on how to teach it. We've overhauled all our materials. As Morgan Polikoff talked about yesterday, we need a new round of textbook adoptions. Those teachers are increasingly moving away from textbooks to digital, and we've been working intensely on getting those more digital resources in the curriculum and to back up the curriculum content. And so that job's not complete, but we did make major changes in all. We got rid of all our instructional materials from the older part. Then we went through principal and teacher policy, pre-service education. My colleague at Stanford, Linda Darling-Hammond, was appointed by Governor Brown as the head of the Independent California Teacher Commission, and she has really done quite a job on upgrading what it takes to be a teacher in California, and then not accrediting some of the weaker ones. The in-service and professional development, I'll come back to that. That's a huge problem. It's a work in progress. I'll have a separate slide on some of that. Teacher evaluation, we have done nothing. So that's a gap. I'd like to do more, and I think now would be a time we could do it rather than in 2015. So that's one of the gaps that was there. State assessments, we are in smarter balanced assessment, and we believe it is the strongest assessment of those out there. It is, of course, computer adaptive, has extended response where you have to defend your answer, and has a performance exam at the end of an hour and a half in high school and an hour in K-8. So we have a lot more to do with the assessment to enable it to be helpful to teachers. We're on the way of breaking it down to various instructional targets. We've worked with Smarter Balance's digital library, which all our teachers have an account, and if they encounter things in the assessment, they can go to the digital library, and it's part of the Smarter Balance system. So we have assessment, and it's aligned with Common Core. Special education, there's an area often overlooked, and we have been able to make a start on multiple tiered services, and also in bringing special education much closer into the Common Core, and it's a major area of our assistance out there in the field now. But it's essentially, we did a task force report with a set of policies called All One System, so we've worked heavily on that. Finance, the finance formula not only controlled the system, but it is driven heavily by what the people call weighted pupils. You get 20% more per pupil if you have a student who is low income, uh, English learner and not low income, not a lot of those, or foster care. And if you have a concentration, here's really what we did, which is, as far as I know, unique. If you have a concentration of 55% of these pupils who are low income, et cetera, you get 45% more per money for all those pupils. So if you go to low income school districts, like small, medium-sized Hispanic suburbs, Alum Rock outside of San Jose, Calexico down in Southern California, and many other districts that have this large number, over 55% low income. We have increased their per pupil expenditures by 50% in 5 years. 50% in 5 years. This thing is highly targeted. It hits the targets. And we've been able to maintain our political coalition of the middle and income, higher income districts as well. We have supplemented the base for them. More of that will be happening this year in the legislative session in June. So the finance system is completely different, and of course it has the local control accountability plan as part of that. English learners, we had separate standards for English learners from the rest. And we completely integrated the English learner standards into the Common Core standards, and we have passed a extensive English learner roadmap for the state to improve English learners. People actually broke down in tears at the board meeting over our approval of this roadmap, which had been the first time we'd really come up with a comprehensive policy to deal with this. Career and technical education. We've spent over $1.5 billion on creating career pathways, linking the secondary school career and tech programs to the community college programs and to business areas of interest. So it's very much a system that has progressions for students and linked courses and high school linked to higher education. College readiness, that's part of it through career and technical ed. But one of my major lines of research from, say, 2000 to 2010 was on college readiness and on the separation of higher education from lower education. So California, all systems of California higher education, public higher education and the private systems, endorse Common Core. That was, I think, crucial. If you're fighting Common Core in California, you're fighting the higher ed system. The community colleges and the California state universities, they use the Common Core Level 3, which is the college and career level that is that the Smarter Balanced Assessment has come up with. Level 3 means you can attend college without being in remediation, and they use that level for the 4-year Cal State system and the 2-year community college for exempting you from placement remediation, and therefore reinforce the high school standards in that regard. And we're under discussion with also having the University of California and Cal State use Smarter Balanced as an admissions factor in their admissions. They're both now quite competitive, so that's there. And so I'm working and communicating with my post-secondary colleagues on a wide variety of issues, and of course they've helped a lot on our teachers. And we've issued lots of waivers and flexibility. So we've covered all of these areas except teacher evaluation, but the problem, and I think it's a line, but there's a lack of depth in it in that regard. So I think just to go underneath some of the slices, this has recently got a book by Ms. Cobb et al., and they have the best diagram I've seen of this area, where you look at trying to meet your learning goals, in our case the Common Core, through various issues in that area. I think our biggest struggle has been getting enough assistance to teachers, quote, professional development on the ground to really make and enable large numbers of teachers to teach, for example, Common Core math. Our results in Common Core math are not good. So we have, the foundations in California have poured money into various kinds of professional learning communities, into networked improvement communities among teachers, subject matter improvement, and I have a map of where we have our assets on the ground, and they're funded by numerous foundations, some by the federal government, and you know, I have areas of intense concentration of resources, and then I have deserts where there is very little on the ground, particularly in the Central Valley of California and out in some of the eastern desert areas in Southern California, for example. So we're trying to maneuver that, but we're really well aware of we need a dense network of providers. We will have $130 million in federal set-asides in the next few months to work on instructional improvement and teacher and leader assistance. We must withhold 7% of Title I. In California, that's about $120 million. We have $6 million out of Title II we can withhold, and we plan to use that for a teacher leaders initiative of various types. And then we have administrative money, which we can don't need for administrators. So we're going to be, the untold story of ESSA, I think, is what are states going to do with this money? I'm going to be the biggest foundation out there in terms of California very soon. So we're going to be working in more around this kind of slide, particularly around teacher learning and things of that kind of area. So I think our plan is to we have to re-grant the money to local education agencies, but we can do that through counties as wholesalers and then have them retail it, the money to the districts and schools. So more to come on that. So I'm approaching the depth problem that I showed you in the overall slide. Okay, this is a part of the famous California dashboard. Let me see if this one's better. Yeah. We have moldable indicators, and the dashboard, you can read them there: chronic absence, suspension, English learner progress, graduation rates. We have the assessments, and I should add 3 through 8 and 11. Not just 3 through 8, 11 on the assessments. And then we're doing a college and career indicator, which is vocational sequences, dual enrollment, and advanced placement, and other indicators that enable you to look at beyond the test scores. The test scores are also embedded in that college and career indicator at the 11th grade. So we're color-coded. Blue is good and green is terrible. I'm sorry, red is terrible, and you want to be blue. And as you see, this is a quick look at it in that regard. So you'll see there that in District X here, or School X, the suspension rate is yellow. That's not good. That's just above orange, which is the worst. And then they have the status. It's low. The suspension rate is low by meaning low. It's not good. It's low on our indicator. And then you have change. It's increasing. And so what we're looking for is continuous improvement. And even if you're low, if you're increasing a lot, we will not require assistance for you. So you are able to see in a glance. We have the breakdowns for the as well on this for each pupil subgroup on all of these indicators. And then this one you probably can't see, but it might be. We have local indicators. Not the first ones I showed you are state indicators. The dashboard has local indicators on them. and they are such things as the resources at the school level, the availability of books and materials and other things of that sort, the implementation of academic standards. We run surveys through WestEd of the implementation of our academic standards and have gathered quite a bit of data on that. And then the locals use use either the WestEd survey or their own survey. They don't send any of this to us. This is their local use. We vet these instruments and then approve them for local use. Parent engagement. The local control accountability plan requires a lot of parent engagement. And then finally, local school climate. That's a work in progress. How do you measure local school climate? We are still working on the terms and the validity and reliability of that, and so we're working on that as we speak. But these are all local. So the dashboard comes back and it has all of these things on it. Overall performance and information about student groups and status and change. So you can look at African American pupils, you can look at each of the indicators at the state level, the ones above the line, on the status and change on either of those. You can look at a single indicator. This is like peeling an onion, where you can break it down in that regard and look at that in great depth rather than just all of them. And you can look at a single student group and look at them on all the indicators, all by district, all by school. So 11,130 schools. So you're getting quite a bit of information on this in regard to that. And the LCAP, the Local Control Accountability Plan, then asks people questions as they look at this, these results on, what are you doing? We don't approve these plans. They don't send them to Sacramento. They have to be approved by their board, and the counties really check for fiscal compliance and that you're following the basics of the form. So this is an area that still, the whole LCAP idea that we're still working with is I think an important area for us to think about, and I'm hoping we can get a more final thing. Okay, now some results, and of course no allegations here of cause and effect. Our 4-year rates, our universities require a certain number of courses called A to G, 4 years of English and 3 years of math. And laboratory science. And as you can see, they are, we've just been skyrocketing in this. We're going up like this. That's the good news on the students eligible for University of California and Cal State. So that curve goes up like that. That's the good news. The bad news is the availability of seats is like that. And so we're producing people with the grades and the test scores the grades and I should say the grades and the, not test scores, but the grades and the curriculum requirements by higher ed at a very high rate. And as you can see, there's some real drops there among subgroups. And so it's pretty encouraging what we're able to do. This is the kind of thing that continuous improvement to me works pretty well on. You have a very defined goal, and then you can measure it and you can see what you're doing. I'm less convinced of continuous improvement for overhauling a whole school district and creating a new culture in that school district. Okay, so that's a little look at the college level. This is our high school graduation rate. There's certainly continuous improvement. So we're, reasonably happy with that. Of course, there's always a ways to go. But again, here you're closing achievement gaps because the students who were dropping out are often low-income minorities in California. Since the Hispanics are the majority, I don't know how to phrase all this. And so that's helpful. Then AP tests, that continues to, that was up before 2013, but has continued to increase. There as well, we see some closing in the achievement gaps because the newer students taking the achievement, the AP tests are more low income, more minorities, not enough, but you got a general trend line. Suspensions, our new suspension policy is obviously having quite a bit of impact, dropping significantly. This has been a really good indicator of that. Another area where continuous improvement, I think, can be of support, and we do that in terms of our analysis and our programmatic follow-up. And lastly, the NAEP. The recent test came out, and our 8th grade reading scores is the biggest 10-year gain in the nation for any state. So, you know, again, no cause and effect. It could have been the corn crop in Iowa that caused this. I don't know. And when most people were flat, we made a few significant gains in reading in that regard, and feel good about that, and generally had some movement up, or at least stayed the same. So in that era, but we're gratified by the reading in an area that the rest of the country was very flat or negative in. So that is the end of my remarks, and I look forward to your questions.
Mike, you can stay there, or you can sit down, whatever your pleasure is.
Yeah, I'll stay here. That's
good. I know there got to be questions, but I have the first two.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I guess my first question is, I mean, there's only one California.
Yeah.
To be sure. But I am curious if you had to kind of summarize what you think you've learned from your experience there, and could generalize or at least comment on what California teaches us about the prospects for change and improvement nationally. I'd be really interested to hear what you thought.
Well, I think some of the themes I've struck here are, obviously, we need to be ready for the long haul. We've done a very strong communications campaign. Be patient, it doesn't turn around immediately. The governor talks about that we look for incremental progress initially, and so I think that's true. I go back to the persistence of not avoid the politics of switching around. These local school districts, they get a new superintendent and they throw out everything and start with something else. So build your political coalition first. So all that politics of education. What I tried to do with students was talk to them about how to build a coalition, how to build a sustained winning coalition. You can have a one-time winning coalition. How do you build a sustained winning coalition? Be a politician in that sense, and think about that, because then you'll be able to persist in that regard. Be willing to have a thick skin. I mean, we were the PEC's bad boy with the Obama administration, teacher evaluation, California in 2013, retrograde state, not getting on with the new reforms. So, just hold on in that regard. And know what you don't know. And focus relentlessly on instruction, and increasingly, and I'm not sure how the social emotional learning movement's going to fit into all this. It's still evolving, and I'm somewhat concerned that we're going to get into policy overload. I visit policy overload with it. I visited a school district which was supposed to be a model one, urban school district, and we had a presentation on social emotional learning. And I said, how does that relate to your curriculum and instruction? Oh, they're over there. That's another division. And I thought, I've seen this movie before. And so watch out that you're going to lose coherence, alignment, depth of your policies. All those things, I think, are really more generic. And we've done so much in professional development that people could learn some of the good things and some of the bad things from us, I think, in that regard. So, and have a strong communications program. I mean, it's just, we shoot at everything that moves that's negative. I mean, with an aggressive communications campaign, and so I think you've got to keep the public opinion at least neutral as you move forward. I mean, immediately with the local control funding formula, they wanted to, various groups wanted to recreate Title I in 1977. Have it all tightly earmarked down to the school and all of that. So we just fought a huge battle that were communications-wise that no, we don't have the answers here in Sacramento, and I'm not playing that game. I've seen that movie too, and I'm not going to rerun it.
So my second question has to do with the research community. Half the time I think the research community looks at the policy community and the policymaking process and says, oh, you knuckleheads, all you know how to do is screw things up. And then the other half of the time, there's this deep ambition to influence policy. Do you have any advice for us about how we ought to think about all of that? What should mid-career researchers, for instance, do?
Okay, my first theme from the early part of the talk is you're more influential than you think. You're doing enlightenment, you're challenging assumptions, you're highlighting problems in that regard, and that is important because some of those problems get onto political agendas and get prioritized, and that has some political aspects to it, but as other. You're doing a lot of implementation research that is being highly recognized and used. You've done evaluation research for years. We need to know how well we're doing in that regard. So, and policy researchers increasingly come up with some fairly specific policy alternatives, or at least the outlines of them. So that would be, don't think it's going to be straight line. It's going to percolate. It's going to creep, and you should enlighten us. Things. As a policymaker, I hear of things, and then I store them somewhere, and then it comes back when I see these things growing. I'd read about suspension stuff years ago, never did a damn thing about it, and then it becomes on the agenda, and I'm able to pull that stuff from what I knew before. So that I think is important. And the second is the brokerage function. I think AERA is not going to be a policy research broker. It's sort of a difficult thing for a huge and diverse organization like this. So really, find brokers and translators and reducers of complexity and work through them. And I created PACE, and I think that stands well there. As an example of that.
Great. All right, let's see what's on your mind. I'm actually going to bring this out if it might help, but I'm going to stay close to the person asking the question to make sure that they don't ask the question too long. How you doing, Henry?
Hi. Good morning. Thank you for your talk. I have a two-sided question. You spoke about the $60 billion that's been spent on education reform and how you've really implemented a kind of a policy of subsidiarity so that local districts have more control. To what extent was that policy itself influenced by research? And to what extent are the ways in which different districts, the LEAs, spending that money, to what extent is that influenced or informed by educational research around what works and what really makes a difference in student learning?
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer the second question because there's not a lot of data on that, but the first question was, I think there was the whole backlash to the specificity of No Child Left Behind, which was really part of the research, was clearly in this, that we needed to return more flexibility to people closer to the ground and closer to doing it. And that, I think, was very important. I mean, Dick Elmore's research title called Reforming Schools from the Inside Out. That was one of his later pieces. I mean, that's just, see, I started in a federal era of top-down and enforcement from the Great Society, and the whole concern in Title I early on was, well, the locals are diverting the money out of the low-income schools. Keep tightening the screws, keep tightening the screws. And so I participated in building this monster that I'm now trying to decapitate, of Title I coordinators at the state level who report to Title I coordinators in the local districts who report to Washington, and keep the money over there, and have it in small projects and don't have it related to instruction. So we were in a compliance enforcement mode, a top-down mode, and I think if you're going to reform schools from the inside out, you've got to change those policies dramatically. So I think just a whole bunch of research went that way. And we got a strong backlash then of they're going to misuse the money locally, and there were a few that did, and we caught a few. And thank God for the lawyers in California. They ran around suing them, the local districts, so that was nice. And I think we've got that down to the diversion of the money going for the low-income pupils into the general system. So I think it's a vast weight of research that went that way. And if you're into improving instruction, the research was overwhelming that's really hard to do from state capitals, and by sending out people approved by state capitals. California had a list of providers in the 1990s, and they were state-approved list, and you could only pick from the state-approved list to assist you. I mean, the research was really negative on that one. And so I think it's the drift of the research that influenced the deregulation, and the humility from that you just can't do much as much from the center as you think. The local level, it's harder. I think that harder to document. I think one issue that has concerned me that I've written on extensively in the past is school boards. They have not really had a high penchant for research. There are 95,000 elected officials of those critters called school boards out there. They are in a perfect position. We have a state board. We're a policy state board. You can see from this that we're a state board of appointed people and we're policy oriented. The typical school board meeting is not marked by a high use of empirical research, let me put it that way. You've got a governance system, so it really relies, I think, more on the administrators and others to help the school boards, and that's a whole other set of literature. I wanted to rename the school boards and make them education policy boards and get them out of fixing all these local problems. You know, the shower's leaking at Berkeley High and they call a school board member to fix the shower and so on. I mean, you know, this is, the school board is the legislative, executive, and judicial branch of government all wrapped into one. So I think that needs to be overhauled, but I think there's a significant amount, but I can't really comment on that in any significant amount of use of research, but I really can't comment on that.
I'm an emeritus professor at UCLA, but I've lived outside of California for 20 years, and 3 weeks ago we moved back to California, so I'm a resident again. And so I want to commend you on the quality of the presentation. The rest of you, I'm sure, thought it was very thought-provoking. For me, it was remedial catch-up. It was really nice to find out what the hell's going on in the state very quickly. That's probably all the attention I want to give to it now. But one of your remarks, Michael, that seemed very thought-provoking was the fact that you identified an unattended to area as teacher evaluation, and the bargain you worked out, and the reason that the California Teachers Association was agreeable to this model. I'm really intrigued as to how you're going to deal with that again. Has the teachers suddenly became welcoming? What are you going to do with it? Is it just going to be focused on formative or summative? How are you going to deal with that?
How are we going to work with not the evaluation or with the formative and summative use?
Teacher evaluation, are you going to try to make it mostly formative, soft, or are you going to, in other words, are you going to really address it in what form?
Yeah, I have no idea about that, and the conversation is dormant in the state. There's not even any proposals or momentum coming forth. As you know, Jim, and we're operating under the old Stoll Act, which was around in the early 70s when you and I were in our prime, I guess, and that law is really, I find school board members don't even know the law exists, so I have no thoughts on that at this point. I think that we'll have a new administration in 2019. But it is, as you know, dropped off of a lot of the national discussion and dropped off in the states that have it. So I think, what have we learned from the evaluations, and how would that guide states like California that have really a blank slate and have nothing invested in anything of that type? That would be, really useful piece of research for us. I have not seen much of that. And a lot of the people, my impression is, including in talks with people here, is that a lot of states are hanging on to their old policies, but they really don't have any effect and they don't really have any discussion around them, and they seem to have somehow, the teachers have accommodated to them. And so, this was something that came and went. So we've seen these things go through education quickly, but we need to do it. It shouldn't go on like this, but I haven't seen something that says, here's what we learned, and this ought to guide states that are not invested in any particular system, because our openness to it is an advantage, it seems to me, rather than one of these states which has already fought this battle and doesn't want to open it again. And so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I'm Mark O'Shea. I'm a teacher educator at Cal State Monterey Bay. But I've also been a teacher educator across other states in the country. As a matter of fact, when I was a teacher educator in New Jersey, I was witness for plaintiff in Abbott versus Burke for the school funding formula that exists in New Jersey, of which there's been a great deal of legacy since those days.
My question pertains to the instructional vision that you had up there before, identifying a three-part approach for teacher improvement around the pull-out for professional development and the instructional coaching and the teacher collaboration time. Now that third piece, the teacher collaboration time, I so admire the progress that's been made there, because that has been a tremendous improvement in working conditions, teachers having a chance to actually talk and work with each other about the improvement of instruction. But the other two elements, the rolling out of the PD and the instructional coaching, where I am in the Salinas Valley in Central California, I see the school districts putting an awful lot of their local spending money, which has been freed up through your policy, into this assisting each other in coaching and peer support. But this has been taking the teachers out of the classrooms, which is, kind of like an unanticipated problem. And the teacher shortage challenges are just unbelievable. So I was wondering if, looking forward, how you might see some means by which policy around teacher professional development and teacher improvement is not to conflict with the need to come up with an adequate supply of high-quality teachers.
Yeah, that was the biggest negative thing that hit the reform era that I, from 2010 to 2018 was the teacher shortage, and particularly acute in some California communities with very high housing costs. To compound the problem, which is national. And in 2011-12, teacher ed was still being reduced by, there was a lack of demand, and they were, and so there wasn't demand. The teacher prep institutions were under-enrolled at that point because of the lack of demand, but we didn't really see the shortage coming as it has come. So it's a major problem, and the California will be putting money into alleviating the teacher shortage. We haven't done that much. We first the governor put in the budget for this year, 2018, $100 million to increase the supply of special ed teachers. Now, I worry we don't have enough suppliers, including Cal States, that are going to be able to deal with that. And so we see that money spent out over many years. And I believe the legislature will add money in some of the other subject matter areas as well, mathematics being my second candidate for a really big expenditure blitz thing. I don't believe that without some aggressive policy that we're just going to ride this out with the normal cycles. We need to do stuff. And that is a state responsibility in my view. And so I see this year as a watershed year for intervention. We couldn't get, I don't know, the political momentum. I mean, Linda Darling-Hammond was screaming in my ear 3 years ago about this, and I have a very close relationship with the governor, and we just couldn't get there and finally we got it this year with a commitment that we're really in trouble and we really need to get aggressive. So help is coming. That's about all I can say, but it's late.
All right, so just so people are aware, we have about 10 minutes left. I know that the questions will become ever more efficient, right?
All right. Hello from California also. As a principal who's gone through the ranks of teacher, instructional coach, principal, and now presenting at AERA this week with my dissertation, I want to say thank you for the long-term focus that you've had on policy to allow the depth of implementation. From the practical level at the schools, if you were to think about an organization that would be well aligned to take advantage of the vertical alignment that has been set up in California, what would be the knowledge bases or organizations that school districts and schools should be tapped into to make the most out of that long-term alignment?
Well, there's a whole, you know, there's a whole array of them. And I think what school districts need to do, and county offices and other people help them to do, and subject matter personnel, is look at what's out there. I don't know, I mean, the California foundations have stepped up enormously. They have been mostly really behind this, particularly the ones in the San Francisco Bay Area, and have created, you know, Math in Common and all kinds of programs and assistance groups, particularly in improving instruction and local leadership. So I think one needs to get a list of these, a person you can contact who's on top of this. We run a provider conference of providers who come and talk about what's going on, and the contact person is a woman, Jan Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R, with the Sacramento County Office of Education. She, with Jennifer O'Day, runs an organization of these providers, and I would contact her and just say, you know, tell me about the providers there are in that regard. So it's interesting. They also run something I want to mention, and that's, I think, really unique, and Jim Popham was just on the phone. Every Monday at 8 o'clock in the morning, we have state policymakers and some local educators talk about how we're doing on what I've just talked about, particularly on implementing curricular standards. And we talk 8 o'clock for an hour every Monday, and it's all about where we're not doing well enough. And that group also, the 8 o'clock phone call, Linda Darling Hammond's on it as well. The 8 o'clock phone call then has produced a provider surveys, and that's all managed by the Sacramento County Office of Education through a grant from some foundation. I don't know which, Stewart probably is in the middle of that. So yeah, it is interesting that the top people confer with local people as well to see. We know we're not good enough in this. So I had Jim come on and talk 2 weeks ago about, yeah, we got smarter balance, but how good is that for formative assessment? And what do we need to do to get beyond that, or do the best we can with the assessment and get beyond that, an assessment as a way we're thinking about this.
Hi, Mike. I'm the CPRE Knowledge Hub Director at the University of Pennsylvania. My question revolves around the importance of state boards in education policymaking. A couple of states right now, Utah, Missouri, and North Carolina, have their governors or their state legislators are thinking about dissolving their state boards. Can you tell us a little bit about why state boards are important and what's a cautionary tale that those states should be aware of?
Yeah, I cannot because it's so varied across the country. We're really unusual. When Schwarzenegger was in office, nobody knew who was in charge. He had a Secretary of Education. He had a big staff in his office. He had a State Board of Education that he appointed. We have an elected state superintendent. And you know, Brown said, I'm abolishing the Secretary of Education. I'm going to put only public troubleshooters in my office for political problems in education, not to do what we talked about today. And I'm going to run the whole thing through the State Board of Education, through you, me. And so so the executive director of the State Board of Education in California is the special advisor to the governor. Her name is Karen Staff Walters. There's only one special advisor. My state board staff is his staff. I have 11 professionals. We do the bill analysis in the state board office on the bills that he should sign coming through the legislature. So there's a single point of decision making. There's about 4 players that, are calling the shots, and you know where to go. So this is so unlike state boards, and we relate to the National Governors Association. We don't even belong to NASB, the state board. We're an adjunct in some ways of the governor's office. We are term appointees. We cannot be fired during our terms, but so we really relate to NGA. And so I go to our staff goes to, I don't go much, but to their meetings. So it's really unusual. And only Jerry Brown would come up with something like that. I can't imagine that would continue. But so the state board and the elected state superintendent, who's a good friend and been aligned with us all the way and helpful, is Tom Torlakson. He sort of, we work it out with him, in that regard. I was state board president before under the late Wilson C. Riles, and he told me something I carried around, which is, Mike, in many ways, my State Department staff is your staff. And he's right. I couldn't we wouldn't have done any of this without the State Ed Department staff. So we worry about them and their quality of their staff and so on. And a lot of our appointees at the state board staff are governors exempt appointees. So I can bring people in without civil service, pay them more, It's quite a system, yeah. So and how that relates to the other state boards, I have no idea. And I haven't really talked to many of them.
Very quickly, my name is Richard Graham with the Metropolitan Center at NYU. You mentioned the A to G as being a successful effort, and I know that it started with a group of community-based organizations working in coalition with researchers and policymakers to push sort of this equity initiative. And so I'm interested in hearing the role that organizations that have connections to communities, have roots in communities, are in the process of pushing the educational agenda. And the second thing is, very quickly, you mentioned your communication. We're in an era where anything that's public is seen as bad. And we're in an institution, public education, that's terrible at talking about what we do. So what are the ways that we need to talk or change the way we communicate what happens in schools so that it changes the public narrative about public schools?
Yeah, those the community organizations, and there are very few people studying them. John Rogers at UCLA looks at some at this. I can't believe how many there are, and I don't know what role they're playing. I know how many confront me, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, that are, every ethnic racial group is organized in California, and then there's the Californians for Justice and PICO, and numerous other kinds of local groups. We have aggressively tried to create local groups through the Local Control Accountability Plan by requiring public engagement in that. And so we need more groups. This is local groups lobbying at the local level. It's so much cheaper if you're running an advocacy group or a group to lobby the Capitol, because that's the one stop. But when you have 1,000+ school districts, I really would like to trace this. Don't have a lot of knowledge. There's not a lot of scholars looking at this kind of grassroots politics and documenting it. So I only know about what comes to us. I think the narrative has changed on education. I remember meeting with Susan Furman and the CPRI group, I believe it was about 2011, and the narrative had gotten away from what I was talking about today. There was another narrative, and I think that, as and the teacher strikes are the latest wave of this, but I think it's come off of, it's all just accountability. I'm for accountability, but not, that's your overwhelming policy instrument. It's less about, unrestricted choice, less about teacher evaluation, It's less about unions are the problem, and if we attack the unions, then we're going to succeed in improving education. Never made any sense for me to, like some of these states where the people got elected and the first thing they did was declare war on their workforce. I don't know any business that perceives that way, but that was part of the narrative. So I think all of that is toned down. In a particular splinter group of the Democratic Party called Democrats for Education Reform, I think were very influential in New York, and I think they're less influential now. So I think the narrative clearly has shifted and is shifting more, and it's really down to sort of radical choice alternatives represented by Secretary DeVos, and then there's much more of a feeling that we need to work with our teachers and our leaders, and I think it's shifting more into the narrative I've given today in that regard. Clearly, ESSA is a sort of a testament to the changing narrative. If you look at the apogee of the Obama administration, which was the waiver policy, and I think that's long gone and a good symbol. So I'm not sure where the narrative's going, but I think it is shifting, and the pendulum's coming back, hopefully more to the center, it seems to me.
Well, we are unfortunately at our time. Clearly, we could keep going. Mike, thank you so much for a very...
Thank you.